Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Ridenauer, and we have a really exciting show in store for all of you at home listening and tuning in today, because we finally have playoff baseball. And I can't believe we have arrived at this point of the season, but here we are in the postseason. Hope everyone had a good week and was able to enjoy some of these playoff matchups, and there were some really good games on the first 2 days, but we will get into all of that here in today's show. We do have quite a bit to cover in today's episode, so I want to first jump into recaps of the first 2 days of the playoffs. I'll go around the league and mention the different games from the first couple days of the wild card rounds, who really stuck out to me, mention some of the top performers of the 2 days as well. After segment 1 is wrapped up, I'll head into a discussion in the recent rankings that MLB.com came out with for the top 50 players in the postseason. I'll go through and mention the different players that are ranked and mention a few players who I think should be placed a little higher and who I think could be moved further down the rankings. Next, I'll get into the best wild card games in previous years, selecting which games have really stuck out to me and were very memorable playoff matchups in the do-or-die situation. And be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show today, as I will highlight which players have been struggling this year heading into the playoffs that could turn their seasons around in the postseason. So stay tuned for that final segment today. Like I mentioned, we've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right to it. First day of the playoffs, and it was an exciting one. Jumping into the first game, Astros-Twins. Astros winning 4-1. No runs were scored between the two teams in the first 2 innings, and then Minnesota tacked on 1 run themselves in the bottom of the third. The 4th, 5th, and 6th innings were also scoreless. So through 6 innings, there's only 1 run that was scored. But then Houston was able to ratchet it up a little bit, turn the notch up in the 7th and 9th inning, scoring 1 run in the 7th and then 3 in the 9th, to ultimately propelling themselves to a 4-1 victory over the Twins. Really big game from Michael Brantley. He was responsible for 2 of the 4 runs that the Astros scored. Definitely going to be the top performer of that game for myself. I do have to give a brief shout out, very brief shout out, to Alex Kirilloff, who's actually a greater Pittsburgh area native, initially from Plum, Pennsylvania, which is, again, kind of a community outside of the Pittsburgh area, 30 minutes outside of the city. And he was I believe he was the first ever rookie to start his season, or his MLB debut, starting wise, in the postseason. So getting the first ever, start as a position player in your first ever season, your debut, and it's in the postseason. Pretty incredible thing to have happen. So shout out to Alex Kirilloff. Congratulations on the incredible milestone. Moving into the next game, White Sox Athletics. White Sox winning 4-1. And this Chicago team, I think, is very scary. I think they are a very, very scary team. White Sox scored the first run of the game in the top of the second, and then 2 runs in the top of the third, and no runs were scored between 2 teams in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th innings. So scoreless through those 4 innings. And then in the top of the 8th, the White Sox tacked on another run. Oakland was able to score 1 run in the bottom of the 8th, but it was a final for the White Sox, 4-1. Lucas Giolito pitched an unbelievable game. He was flirting with a perfect game through the first 6 innings of the game. Unfortunately, it was broken up. But again, having him on your team and having him feel that good in the postseason, that's going to be a scary thing moving forward for other teams that have to take on the White Sox. Definitely one of my top performers for the day. Also, Tim Anderson, 3 for 4 for the day against Oakland in that game 1. So also another player of the day for me in that game. And then Jose Abreu, my other top performer in that game 1 for the White Sox and Athletics, 2 for 4 on the day, 2 RBIs. Really, really nice job from him from the plate. Again, really balanced offense for the White Sox. I know that they didn't score a ton of runs, but it was just a great sign from them that they were able to, even if they weren't scoring a bunch of runs, they were still able to capitalize and still win ball games in, lower scoring games with having the pitching that they had in Lucas Giolito. Defensively, they looked phenomenal. Offensively, they looked phenomenal. They're going to be a team to watch moving forward. Next game, Blue Jays versus the Rays. Rays winning this one 3-1, a close one, definitely a close one, closer than I think a lot of people thought it was going to be. Blake Snell struck out 9. He was definitely one of my top players for that game. And then Lourdes Gurriel also, he was a very, very good performer for the Blue Jays. He had a heck of a day from the plate, 2 for 4, really nice job from him, but unfortunately was not able to get it done for his team. Scoreless through the first 3 innings in this one, and then the Rays were able to get things started first with a run in the bottom of the 4th, and then in the 5th and the 6th innings, those were also scoreless. Bottom of the 7th, Rays put on 2 more runs, so some insurance runs, but Toronto, they did make some noise in the top of the 8th. They scored 1 run there. It was a very quiet game offensively for both teams, only 9 total hits in the entire game, and again, in part due to the great pitching from Blake Snell, at least on the Rays end. So great win by the Rays, and then moving into the final game of Tuesday, Yankees-Indians, and it was a complete routing of the Indians for the Yankees. 12-3 victory for the Bronx Bombers. They scored the first 2 runs of the game in the first inning, and then they scored another run in the 3rd. Cleveland was able to score runs in the 3rd and the 4th, but then the Yankees put up 2 in the 4th, 2 runs in the 5th, 4 runs in the 7th, and then 1 run in the 9th before Cleveland was able to put on 1 more run in that bottom 9 inning, but it was not enough. The Yankees put up 4 home runs as a team. Really great outing from them. They absolutely rocked Shane Bieber, gave up 7 earned runs on the day, and for a guy that is pretty much the front runner for the AL Cy Young, that is not a good way to start these playoffs at all. So again, very tough outing for Shane Bieber, but for the Yankees, I mean, they had a lot of guys that did a lot of damage. Couple big time, top performers from those games. At least for the Indians, I will have to give my credit to Josh Naylor, who actually also set a record for being the first player to ever compile hits in his first 5 at-bats. So he was a perfect 5 for 5 through his first 5 playoff at-bats, and he was 4 for 4 in that game 1 against the Yankees. Did a really nice job. He scored a run. He also drove in he scored 2 runs, and he drove in 1 run. So he had a really good offensive day, really the only offensive spot for the Indians. And then over for the Yankees, I mean, DJ LeMahieu doing damage as always, another top player from that game for me. Luke Voit, same thing with him. I mean, Voit was 2 for 5. He had an RBI. Gleyber Torres, he was 4 for 4. I'm going to actually put him in there right now. Gleyber Torres, also another big time performer, and Brett Gardner. They had 4 guys that were a top performer for me on that day. DJ LeMahieu was 2 for 5 with 1 RBI. Gio Urshela was 1 for 4. Gleyber Torres was 4 for 4 with 3 RBIs. Brett Gardner was 3 for 5 with 3 RBIs, also had a home run. So offensively, I mean, this Yankees team was rolling in the first day of the playoffs, and they looked really, really good. So I will tip my hat to them. Now moving into day 2 of the playoffs for Wednesday. Going to get into it, starting with the late game and then going back into the early game and going from there. First one, Brewers-Dodgers. Dodgers winning this one 4-2. And I will say, I was actually kind of excited, I guess, or shocked, if you will, that I got the notification on my phone that they had the Brewers had scored. They had hit a home run, and I said, oh my gosh, they might actually win. They're only down 3-2, but ultimately they lost 4-2. In this one, runs were scored by the Dodgers in the first 2 innings, 2 in the first, and then 1 in the second. Was scoreless in the 3rd, and then the Milwaukee Brewers answered with a run in the top of the 4th, and then in the bottom of the 7th, the Dodgers put on that 1 insurance run, and they were able to win ultimately 4-2. Corey Seager with a monster home run on the day, 447-foot bomb. He had a really great day, and then Walker Buehler struck out 8. He had a great day, another top performer in that game. But over for the Brewers, a big top performer for them, Avisel Garcia. He had a really, really good day from the plate, and then Orlando Arcia also. He was responsible for their 2 runs with a huge home run. Did strike out 3 times, but again, he was still able to drive in some runs and get some offensive production on the board for them. Christian Yelich did have an okay day from the plate. He was 2 for 5, but then over for the Dodgers, great day from Mookie Betts. He was 2 for 4 with an RBI. Corey Seager, again, he was 1 for 3 with an RBI. So although the offense was not, humming like it usually is for the Dodgers, they were still able to score the necessary runs that they needed to ultimately propel themselves to a game 1 win and a 1-0, a series lead over the Brewers right now. Moving into the next game of the day 2 of games, and this was a game 1 battle also, Reds-Braves, and this was a great one. I was sitting there watching it yesterday afternoon, and, Trevor Bauer looked unbelievable. I mean, he really looked comfortable, and that was a very scary sight. I mean, the Braves looked like they had no answer for Bauer, and it's unfortunate that the Reds can't, clone Trevor Bauer 4 times over, because if they could, they'd probably be one of the better teams in baseball, because the way he pitched, he looked phenomenal. His curveball was dropping, his fastball was zipping right in. He had great velocity on his fastball, and he was, pumping upper 90s much into the game. His durability looked really, really good too. So definitely a top performer for the game for me. And then Freddie Freeman on the other end for the Braves, also a top performer. But getting into the scores of this one, this actually wound up in a 13-inning decision, completely scoreless through the first 12 innings of the game. No runs were scored. It was a 1-0 decision by the Braves. Freddie Freeman walked it off with a hit. That was it. That was pretty much the entire ball game. Other than the highlighting of Trevor Bauer. Although the Braves did get the win, I think that, everybody needs to pay attention and talk about how well Trevor Bauer pitched in his, postseason, start for this, the 2020 postseason. Moving into the next game 2 now for the Astros and Twins, and this actually propelled the Astros into the ALDS now. Astros winning 3-1. And I have to take a minute on the Twins, because I really don't know what to think of this team in the postseason. They just seem to never really get a groove in the postseason. They just can't seem, nothing translates from the regular season into the postseason for them. Not quite sure why, but it just doesn't seem to really, bode well for them. They can't perform well in the postseason in the most crucial time. And I remember mentioning, so many months ago, that this is a team that's probably going to make the playoffs. And to look at them and to watch them in the playoffs, because they actually might make a run, because I think in previous years their issue has been fatigue, guys getting injured or guys slowing down towards the end of the season. They still make the playoffs, but then once they get into the playoffs, then it's kind of, where do we go from here? Guys are fatigued, guys are injured, guys are sore, guys are this, that, and the other, and they're not performing well, and then they lose in the first round every single year of the playoffs. So another struggling postseason performance by the Twins. Astros, are they starting to prove people wrong? Are they starting to, shut up the haters a little bit? Myself included, I am not a big Astros fan at all. I was actually very annoyed that they won, because, again, going back to last year, I think it's very unfortunate that a team had the feeling and had the need that they did to ultimately, cheat their way to World Series and cheat their way to the playoffs on numerous occasions. That does not sit well with me. But again, they were able to win somehow, some way. In the game, scoreless through the first 3 innings, and then Astros scoring 1 run in the top of the 4th. Minnesota answered with a run in the bottom of the 5th, but then the Houston Astros were able to score a run in the 7th and a run in the 9th, ultimately winning 3-1. George Springer was hitless. Jose Altuve was hitless for the Astros. Michael Brantley was hitless. Alex Bregman had a hit. Kyle Tucker was really the main spot for the Astros. Him and Carlos Carrera, the only two that had 2 hits on the day. Very, very quiet, hitting performance by this Astros team. Only 5 hits in the win. The Twins only had 3 as a collective. So again, very quiet offensive series, and a very quick series at that. Astros are now moving into the ALDS, and the Twins, they're packing their bags and they're heading back to Minnesota. Next game, Marlins, Cubs, and surprisingly enough, the Miami Marlins won this one 5-1. I know. Hey, I was just as shocked when I saw that as well. No runs were scored in the first 4 innings of this one. The Cubs were able to score the first run of the game in the bottom of the 5th, but then a 5-run 7th inning was what made the difference in this one, and it was a 5-run 7th inning for the Miami Marlins. Corey Dickerson had a huge hit that drove in 3 runs for them, 3 of their 5. Jesus Aguilar also had a really good day. He was 2 for 5 from the plate, driving in 2 runs. So really, their 5 runs were coming from 2 different players. And then over for the Cubs, Ian Happ, he had a pretty solid day. I will give him that. Although it wasn't enough to help his team win, he was 2 for 4 from the plate, and then 1 RBI, the lone RBI of the game for the Cubs. Marlins are up 1-0 in that series, so it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out, and if the Cubs are able to come back and potentially tie this up and then force a game 3, or if the Marlins are going to be moving on. That would be, again, that would just add to the weirdness, I think, of this 2020 year. Moving into the next game, a game 2 for the White Sox Athletics. Athletics have now tied the series up 1-1 after a 5-3 win over the White Sox. Oakland getting things going right away, scoring 2 runs in the bottom of the 1st and then 2 runs in the bottom of the 2nd, while then tacking on another run in the bottom of the 4th. But the White Sox were able to make some sort of noise in the latter part of the game, scoring 2 runs in the top of the 8th, while they also tacked on 1 run in the top of the 9th. So they did make a little noise. They did make some sort of a comeback. But again, it was not enough. Marcus Semien for the Athletics had a huge 2-run home run. Ramon Laureano also had a really big day from the dish. I mean, this Athletics team, if they're able to complete this comeback, they're a scary team, because I feel like although they don't have, anybody hitting above 300 in their lineup, really, I will say they have guys that are able to hit at the most opportune times. They perform at the best possible situations that, present themselves. So again, that could be, something to look at. Laureano was 2 for 4 from the plate. Tommy La Stella, who was a really big midseason pickup for them, 1 for 4 from the dish. I mean, although, he wasn't playing great for the Angels, he came over to the Athletics and he started playing much better. He was hitting above, I believe, 280 at one point of the year. And then also for the White Sox, Yasmani Grandal, he had a really, really big day for himself also. 1 for 3 RBIs. So again, he was, responsible for a good bit of this offense. But, again, not enough to beat the Athletics. And again, how does the pitching fare after Keuchel and Giolito, right? I feel like it's kind of similar with the Reds. You've got Sonny Gray and you've got Trevor Bauer, but then where do you go from there? Now, I will say for the Reds, they've got TJ Antone, who's been great, and then Luis Castillo, who's also a former All-Star, so somebody that is definitely capable of putting up big-time numbers, on the mound. But for the White Sox, it's kind of dips down a little bit. But I will say they still have a pretty solid rotation, and they've got a great bullpen, so I think that they'll be just fine. I'm definitely excited to see, how that one plays out and who ultimately is going to win that Game 3 decision, because, it could be either or. Although the White Sox are a 7 seed, I don't see them as a 7 seed. I personally see them a little bit higher than that, actually much higher than that. I think that they're one of the better teams in the AL, and I think that they've got the AL MVP on their team in Jose Abreu, and I would be shocked if he didn't win that. I would really be floored. I would be puzzled, actually. Moving into the next game, it was a Game 2 also between the Rays and the Blue Jays, and the Rays, the next team, also punching their ticket over to the ALDS. They won this one 8-2 over the Jays. Tampa scored 1 run in the bottom of the first, but then 6 runs in the bottom of the second. So they're up 7-0 early on. Toronto is able to put on 1 run in the top of the third, but then another run by the Rays in the bottom of the third. So they're already up 8-1. The Rays or the Jays were able to score 1 run in the top of the fifth, and ultimately it was an 8-2 decision. Tampa Bay putting up 12 hits on the day, doing a really nice job productively from the plate, scoring 8 runs off of 12 hits. I've got to say, Randy Arozarena, he had a heck of a day from the plate. Great day for the DH. He was 3 for 4 for the Rays. He had 1 RBI, 1 walk. And then also Mike Brosu, he was the first baseman for the Rays, 2 for 3 for the day also. Again, those were really kind of the bright spots for this offense. Here and there were some hits also. Renfroe had a hit. Brandon Lau had a hit. Yandy Diaz did not have a hit. He was 0 for 2 from the plate. And again, he's one of their better hitters. So, look to see him possibly get things going and turn things around a little bit in this postseason. But moving on into the ALDS, this Rays team is going to be really exciting to watch. I know a lot of people have them picked as their World Series winners, or at least making it to the World Series. I have them making it at least to the ALCS. Although I don't know how, they'll bode in the next round, and if they're, if they can keep this rolling and if their momentum can carry them forward, I think they'll be all right. But again, it's going to be the hitting, because I think the hitting has been a big question mark in some regards to this year. They don't have anybody that's been lights out hitting wise, but they do have guys that have been productive and that they've been playing well. Willy Adames, he's been doing well. Brandon Lau, again, those two guys are pretty much the constant factors, I will say, in for this team in terms of their offense. Ji-Man Choi also does a nice job. Tommy Pham's not with the team anymore. But again, guys like, Randy Arozarena, he's stepping up. Yandy Diaz stepping up. Guys like that are able to fill in those voids. That's what makes this Rays team so dangerous is, again, they don't have the glitz and glamour that the Yankees have in terms of depth, but the Rays also secretly have a very deep team. It's just with more so kind of just solid baseball players instead of superstar baseball players. So that's kind of the big difference, I think, between the Rays and the Yankees. Moving on to the next game, Cardinals-Padres. This was a Game 1 for these two. Cardinals coming out on top 7-4, and they really, let their presence be known in this one. St. Louis scoring 4 runs in the top of the first. San Diego was able to respond with one run in the bottom of the first, and then San Diego also put on another run in the bottom of the second. So going into the third, it's 4-2, but then St. Louis was able to put a little bit more distance between themselves themselves and the Padres, putting on 2 more runs in the top of the third and make it 6-2. And then San Diego put on another run in the bottom of the third. And then San Diego was also able to put on 1 more run before the Cardinals put on their final run of the game in the top of the ninth, ultimately winning this one 7-4 to take a 1-0 series lead over the Padres. And let me tell you what, if the Padres were not to make it past this first round, I think you could argue that they would have one of the most, I don't want to say disappointing, but they would have one of the most overrated seasons in baseball. And what I mean by this is this. For how good they were this season, and how highly touted they were, and including myself. I mean, a lot of times I've mentioned to friends, hey, I wouldn't be shocked if we saw a Padres-White Sox World Series. How wild would that be? Again, a very power-oriented offensive team. I know that Mike Clevenger has been injured, and that has been a little bit of an issue for them. So that is something to look for, to look at a little bit. Chris Paddock got the start in Game 1, and again, I've been a little critical of Chris Paddock because I personally think he's a little overrated. And again, it showed yesterday. I was not impressed with his outing at all. I did not think that he pitched that great. So I really do worry about this Padres team moving into Game 2 because St. Louis is a team. It's a historic team. It's a team that knows how to win. They're a well-ran ball club. They are managed very, very well. And, being led by a guy like Yadier Molina, who's been there before. I mean, they've got a lot of veterans. Matt Carpenter, Colton Wong, Paul DeJong. They've got guys that have been around the block many, 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 many times. So as a result, it kind of gives that feeling of, okay, they might, although they don't have kind of the youthful star power that the Padres have with Fernando Tatis and Jake Cronenworth and Trent Grisham, the Cardinals still have that veteran leadership, and they also do have younger guys on the team as well, and they've got great hitting. I mean, Paul Goldschmidt, nobody ever, I feel like, talks about him nowadays, but he's one of the best first baseman hitters in all of the NL, if not all of baseball. So I think that, people might shortchange the Cardinals a little bit just because of the seeding, and that's why I don't like looking at the seeding all that much, because I feel like once you get into the playoffs, that kind of goes out the window, and it's kind of anybody's ball game, really. And especially with this year, you do have home field advantage, but you don't have to play in front of a home crowd. So what does home field advantage really matter? That you don't have to travel as far to the game? I mean, that would pretty much be the only, and anyways, eventually they're going to get in, as they get further into the playoffs, they're going to start having, the games in, Texas, and they're going to have the games in California and wherever else, and having them, in, these hub cities, crowdless games and home field advantage is going to mean absolutely nothing. It's going to be a neutral site. It's going to be my team against your team, and whoever is the better team that day comes out and wins. So I think that this whole notion of seeding and everything in the playoffs, again, you have to do it because it does tell who's going to be the home team and who's not. I know you have to do it for the book and for scorekeeping and everything else, and just to be organized and professional. But at the same time, I personally feel like it doesn't really mean a whole lot this year because of the situation of the pandemic and COVID, and there's no fans being allowed. So as a result, it doesn't really seem to matter a whole lot, in my opinion. But that's just me, a little rant for the day. Top players for the Cardinals and Padres game, Tommy Pham. I mean, he had a really, really good day for the Padres, even though he ultimately was not able to help his team win. He was 2 for 4. And then also Jurickson Profar. He was the other guy that had 2 hits on the day. The 2 players that had multiple hits from the plate. And then for the Cardinals, I mean, Yadier Molina, I mean, how can you not, include him? I mean, he was unbelievable. He had 3 for 5. He drove in a run. Paul Goldschmidt was also 1 for 5. He drove in 2 runs. And then Matt Carpenter was 1 for 3. He drove in 2 runs. But Paul DeJong, I mean, he had a great game too. He was 2 for 2, perfect 2 for 2. He had 1 RBI and had 2 walks on the day. So really solid outing out of Paul DeJong as well. I think this Cardinals team is going to be, a team to watch. I really do. I think that's going to be a very interesting series between the Cardinals and the Padres. Moving on to the next one, Yankees versus Indians. Indians losing this one, and Yankees actually advancing on to the ALDS for yet again another year. Yankees winning this one 10-9. Cleveland scoring the first 4 runs of the game. So a big time hole that the Yankees found themselves in. But the Yankees were slowly able to claw themselves back into this one. Yankees scored a run in the second, and then 4 runs in the fourth. So then all of a sudden it's a 5-4 ball game going into the fifth. Yankees scored another run in the top of the fifth, and then the Cleveland Indians scored 2 runs in the bottom of the fifth. Then the Yankees put on 2 runs in the top of the 6th. Indians responded with 2 in the 7th and 1 in the 8th. And then it was a 2-run with 2 outs in the ninth inning. Excuse me, just 2 runs. I'm sorry, just 2 runs in the ninth inning. I mean, that's pretty hard to do. You're down, you're at a deficit. It's, 9-8. And you've got to make some sort of miraculous comeback, especially with the Indians. That momentum had completely shifted for them. I mean, if you think about it, they had scored in the 7th and they'd scored in the 8th. So they scored 3 runs in 2 innings to give themselves a 1-run lead. And the Indians were 3 outs away from pushing it to Game 3. I mean, they were literally 3 outs away from doing that. But for the Yankees, I mean, Giancarlo Stanton, he's definitely a top performer of the day. He had a really great day from the dish. 1 for 2 from the plate, 2 RBIs, and 2 walks. And then also for Gio Urshela, he was lights out, 2 for 5 from the plate with 4 RBIs. So he did a lot of damage for this Yankees team. And then over for the Indians, I mean, Jose Ramirez, he had a really, really good day. He was 2 for 4 with 3 RBIs. So again, big time producer for a lot of runs for this team. But again, this Indians team, I mean, very similar to the Twins. Why is it that these AL Central teams are able to ultimately, I don't want to say flounder in the playoffs, but they just kind of falter towards the latter part of the season. It's like their stamina and their durability kind of goes by the wayside, and they're not able to, they don't have the condition to get into, further into the playoffs, or they just don't have the player makeup. They don't have the personnel on their team that it's enough to take them further into the playoffs. I mean, look at the Yankees, right? I mean, they've got Giancarlo Stanton, they've got Aaron Judge, they've got Gio Urshela, they've got Gleyber Torres, they've got Luke Voit. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and you're excluding, guys like Brett Gardner, who had a huge home run in Game 1. So they've got just the depth to go further into the playoffs than a team like the Indians. And also, everybody's been touting Jose Ramirez as the MVP for this year. If he were to win it off of just having 1 good month in the entire season, I would personally be very, very shocked by that. I mean, very shocked. I mean, the numbers that Jose Abreu has been putting up and had put up in this regular season, unbelievable numbers. I mean, he had almost 60 RBIs on the year, and if he does not win the MVP, I would personally have something to say about that. Especially if I was Jose Abreu, I would be very, very annoyed with that. But anyways, we'll just move on from that and getting into the second segment. So that'll do it for us in this first segment. But stay right there, folks, because after the commercial, I'm going to talk about the MLB.com's top 50 postseason players list for this season and mention which players I liked in those spots and who I think were ranked incorrectly. Folks, stay right there. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour with you all, and in our first segment, I got into the recaps of the first 2 days of the wildcard matchups. A lot of great action in those first 2 days of the playoffs. Really excited to see how this postseason unfolds. Be sure to stick around for the final few minutes of the show, as I will highlight the players who have been struggling mightily coming into the playoffs that could turn their season around in this month of October. I want to now discuss MLB.com's top 50 players in the postseason this year and which players I thought were ranked correctly and which I felt should have been moved further down the list. So I'm obviously not going to run through all 50 picks because that would just take way too long. So I'm going to just get into the picks that I don't like, some players that I think could have possibly, taken those spots from that said player, and then the picks that I do like, and then mention why I do like those picks. So getting into the picks that I don't like, first and foremost, Mookie at number 1. I'm not a big fan of Mookie Betts at number 1. Why don't I like this? Well, I'm not saying I hate it, because there are some picks on this list that I am not a fan of at all, that I am really opposed to. I will say the one thing that bothered me mostly about Betts being the best player in the playoffs this year is there are a ton more guys who could be number 1 that were vital to their team. I mean, I personally think that Shane Bieber was very important to his team and he's clearly dominated the league in pitching. The most likely Cy Young runaway in the AL. I mean, if you think about it, the most likely runaway of it. I don't really think that there could be anybody else in the AL that could maybe make a case for it. If he were to be taken off this Indians team, I don't think they'd be the same team that they are right now. Although they did just get an early exit out of the playoffs, I still think that if Bieber was off of the Indians, they probably would not have had the success that they did this year. I mean, the guy was dominant. He won 8 of their however many games that they won this year, 30 plus. Let's say they had 32. Okay, so if he won 8 of their 32 games for them, that's a quarter of their games. So when you think about it, he's responsible himself for a quarter of their wins. That's a good chunk of wins in a very small sample size of 60 games. Now, Betts did play well. Again, not taking anything away from him. But I just don't think he is the number one player in the postseason. That's all. I wouldn't say that I'd probably say he'd be a top 10, definitely a top 15, easily a top 10. But I don't know about number one. I think that was a little aggressive. Betts finished the regular season batting .292. He had 16 homers and 39 RBIs. So some great numbers. But now compare that to the weight of Bieber's numbers, who is first in the entire league in the ERA, first in Ks by a mile, and he's one of 3 pitchers to have 100 plus Ks on the year, and he's tied for the league lead at 8 wins, while leading the AL in that category also. So again, he's done a lot of damage on the mound this year. Now, who could replace Betts for that number one spot besides Bieber? I would also have to say Freeman. I think Freddie Freeman could definitely make a case for it. But for Shane Bieber, besides the fact that the ace for the Cleveland, won the Triple Crown for pitching, he gave up only 21 walks all year out of those, 122 Ks that he had. So a 122 to 21 ratio, K to walk ratio. I'm not going to do the math that quickly right now, but just rounding it, that's about a 5 to 6 to 1, K to walk ratio. That's a pretty high K to walk ratio. He also did a fantastic job of keeping the ball in the park, giving up only 7 homers, and he had a 3.2 WAR. I think he is able to, be considered, at least get consideration for number one, and I personally would put him there, honestly. Freddie Freeman would be another option. You could make an argument for him. He's been batting .341 this season with a .640 slugging percentage and a 1.102 OPS, so over an 1100 OPS. And he also had a .375 average for the month of September, almost 100 points higher from what Betts had at .284. Again, I'm not taking anything from Betts. There are other guys who have been playing, just as good as him. He's got the fact that he's playing on the best team, so that does help him, I think, personally. But, he could absolutely make an argument for him to be there in first, as, Betts did have the highest WAR among those 2 other players mentioned. But again, I don't personally have him there. I would personally have Freddie Freeman or Shane Bieber ahead of Mookie Betts, probably Bieber more so than Freeman. But I will say Betts does, he makes a good case. I will say he makes a good case. The next one, Jose Ramirez at number 5. I was not a fan of his top 5 ranking at all. He did have a monster September. He batted .366. He had a 1.294 OPS, so almost a 1,300 OPS, and he had 69 total bases. He also hit 10 homers, and he had 24 RBIs, so he did have a very good month. But let's look at a guy like Marcell Ozuna, or DJ LeMahieu, or Fernando Tatis, all who have higher WARs than Ramirez. They've played just as good, and I think with his big month of September, it has skyrocketed his status in baseball this year in an overacting way. I think people look at his 1 month of September like, oh my gosh, he's all of a sudden the MVP. This is what we've been waiting for. No, you can't base a guy off of an entire season on just 1 month. You can't do that. An MVP award is for the entire season, not just for 1 month. I think he did win AL Player of the Month for the month of September. So, he got his recognition. But as the MVP, I don't think so. And I think he's a great player, but in terms of the players in this postseason, there are guys who have done much more for their teams this year and have had a much bigger impacts in their lineups. Now, who I think could replace him? Marcell Ozuna, like I mentioned, Fernando Tatis, and DJ LeMahieu. DJ LeMahieu had the 3rd highest WAR in the AL, the highest offensive WAR in the AL, and the highest batting average in the AL as well. So it is no wonder that DJ LeMahieu was in the top 10 of this list, but to not put him in the top 5, I think that is ridiculous. He's been incredible all year long, and he's been a big part of this deep Yankees team. Ramirez does have better power numbers in some regard. He's got higher extra base hit total, as he placed first in the AL this past season and collected 12 more than LeMahieu did. But LeMahieu led the AL in OPS plus with 177 and OPS with 1.011. So he did have better power numbers than Ramirez in some regard himself. A pretty close tie between those two. And I think what breaks it is the league leading and MLB leading batting average. He should have no question been a top 5 player. I don't know why he wasn't. I don't have the list in front of me. I think he was, around 7 or 8, but I would have personally had him in my top 5. Another player, Marcell Ozuna. And I think that he's getting I don't want to say no credit because they've talked a lot about him, but I think that in terms of other guys that I have heard in recent months and in recent weeks and really in recent days, you don't really hear a whole lot about Ozuna. And I feel like as of recently in the news, all you're hearing about is how well Jose Ramirez had been playing. And sure, he was playing well. Yeah, I'll give him that. Again, he exited the regular season and entered the postseason as, probably one of the better players just in that regard. Not for the entire season, though. He was not one of the better players in the regular season. I'm pretty sure he had a sub 200 average for most of the year. I actually think he had a sub 200 average for the first 2 months of baseball. So, having one really good month, or at least he had a sub 200 average for the first month of the season, having a really good average, for the 1 month and having, almost a 1300 OPS for 1 month, that doesn't win MVP. That doesn't give you a top 5 ranking in my book. Marcell Ozuna had a higher overall WAR than Ramirez had. Ozuna has been absolutely tearing it up this season, and he's got a higher average, more total bases, higher OPS plus, slugging percentage, and OPS. He's got more home runs. He's got more RBIs. I mean, what more do you want from Ozuna? He literally outplayed Ramirez in every single category. The guy flat out just put up better numbers than him. To be honest, you could say Ozuna was a big top 10 snub for these players in the postseason rankings. I think he came in at about 12th or 13th, and it was a big miss by MLB.com to leave Ozuna out of this, as he led the NL in home runs and RBIs and total bases as well. So Ozuna should be in this top 10 and possibly over Ramirez. Another guy, like I mentioned, Fernando Tatis. This one would be a tough one because Ramirez did hit better for average than Tatis did. Tatis hit at 277 for the year. Ramirez hit 292. He was able to change that batting average that he initially had, Ramirez that is, from I think it was around 230, 240 to 292 because of the monster September. So 1 month was able to flip his entire year around. They did have virtually the same home run and RBI numbers, with Ramirez being 1 higher in RBI. But Tatis has a higher WAR, and he had more triples with 10 as opposed to Ramirez's 6. So there were some power numbers that Tatis had Ramirez beat on. Regardless, though, I think Tatis would have been, the hardest argument out of the 3 to make to be ahead of Ramirez. But I think ultimately you could still make a legitimate argument for Tatis. But I think the biggest one is Ozuna. I mean, having Ozuna not there and not having him over Ramirez, and he literally had better numbers than Ramirez did in all of those major power categories, and probably even beyond, all the, nitty gritty statistic categories that are very, finite and very, minuscule. I bet you he probably had better numbers than Ramirez did in those also. But again, we can't go back, and I'm not going to be able to convince MLB.com to change anything. So next pick that I was not a big fan of, Cody Bellinger at number 21. To the life of me, I don't understand why everyone gives Bellinger the benefit of the doubt this year. I'm not saying in general, but generally speaking, he is a great baseball player. He really is. But when it comes to this season, there is no shot he is remotely close to being within or on the outside looking in just about of the top 20 on this list. I mean, he came in at number 21, so he's right there on the outside looking in for the top 20. I don't see him being a type of player that is that highly regarded in this list at all. His WAR is way down from last year, going from a 9.1 last year to a 1.4 this year. So a drastic decrease in production for Bellinger in that category. His offensive WAR also plummeted from 6.6 a year ago to 0.9 this season. So a big drastic drop off. And he saw dips in his OPS, his slugging percentage, his OBP, and his batting average. And for him to be, number 21 on the list, I think it's a clear sign there are certain, players that will get the benefit of the doubt for a bad year if they are on a good team or have good years in the past. It is clear as day that we're seeing it right now. And sure, Bellinger has been great, no question. I mean, he was a reigning MVP from last year. But if you look at him in terms of this season alone, he clearly is not a top 25 player in the playoffs at all. There are a few players who I feel, should have been, received much more well and had a much more of a nod in that top 20, top 25 area over Bellinger. But again, we can't do anything about it. Who I would personally replace on that over Bellinger? Tim Anderson, Nelson Cruz, and Teoscar Hernandez. Tim Anderson, again, all 3 of these guys had way better numbers than Bellinger had, so it would probably be very easy to make a case for any 3 of these guys. But for Tim Anderson, he batted .322, and he had an .886 OPS. Should be enough for a reason why he should be placed higher than Bellinger. There's 10 spots that separate these two, and I think it's insane, not to mention that, what's even more insane the entire idea that Tim Anderson was not within the top 20 is a wild idea to me. That just doesn't make any sense at all. And, it's just, what's even more insane, though, is that Anderson's batting average has dropped in each month he has played. Okay, so in every single month that he has played, his batting average has dropped. So for July, he hit 333, while in August it was 329, and in September it was 314 at its lowest. Okay, so remember that. He dropped in every single month of this year. Still stayed above 300 in every month, but still dropped. Bellinger didn't even come close to those averages in the 3 months we had in the regular season, with his best average month at 267 in September. So there are plenty more ways in which we could mention how Anderson has been light years ahead of Bellinger today, but I won't go through all of them. I'll get into the next guy, Nelson Cruz. He was only one spot behind Bellinger, but the fact that Bellinger was still one spot ahead of him, I mean, that just really rubbed me the wrong way. Cruz is across the board, his numbers were all better than Bellinger, and he's doing all of that at 40 years old. I mean, he's double the age of Bellinger just about. Their WARs are pretty similar, so no big difference there, but it's the power numbers that are night and day between the two sluggers, with Bellinger having a 113 OPS plus as opposed to Cruz having a 169 OPS plus. So vastly different numbers there. I mean, almost a 40-point difference. Cruz was a big part of this team, and whereas the Dodgers, I mean, they didn't skip a beat with Bellinger struggling all year. So that clearly tells me the importance of Cruz to his team is vastly more significant, in my opinion, than it is for Bellinger to his team based on their numbers just this year. Again, I am looking at it in regards to just this season, because if you're going to take a list of the top 50 players for the postseason from this year, you have to look at how they played just this year and not previous years. Cruz clearly should have been placed ahead of Bellinger, and I think it's absurd he wasn't. And then the last guy to mention, Teoscar Hernandez. I mean, he had a ginormous year, and honestly, he had a career year. And for him to be placed well behind Bellinger, he was actually 13 spots behind him. He was I think he was 34th. Hernandez batted a career-high 289 for the year with 16 homers, which was his third highest total, and probably would have had more to that total if it hadn't been for the shortened season. Bellinger did have a higher strikeout number than Hernandez did, but Hernandez's OBP and slugging percentage numbers are way better than Bellinger's were this year. Again, this, ranking, this could be, his ranking could be the way it is because of the weight Bellinger does carry as a former MVP and All-Star and an established player on a top-tier team. Most likely. I'm not saying that is the clear reason. I'm just saying that is most likely a reason. But again, if we were basing it strictly off the two players' numbers this past season, Hernandez across the board had better numbers than Bellinger did in just about every category you could think of. And honestly, all three of them did. So those three picks I was not a fan of. Mookie at 1, Jose Ramirez at 5, and Bellinger at 21. I honestly don't think Bellinger should have been within the top 40. Maybe in the last 40, I would probably put him there. Because he is an established player, and he has shown himself and proved himself to be a very good baseball player in the league. I'm not taking anything away from him. But he's very hot and cold. He's very hit and miss. I mean, his rookie year was great. His sophomore season was a big slump. And then he comes back for his third year and he wins the MVP. And then in his fourth year, again, the pandemic did not really help, I think, a lot of these top tier players. I'm going to get into it a little bit later. Some of these guys that really struggled going into the postseason because of this season, and just kind of, I think, the parameters of it and, 60 games and this, that, and the other, couldn't get into a groove, couldn't get a feel. Shouldn't be a huge excuse, but I know players will use it. But ultimately, I think if you're basing it off of this year, those three guys should not have been in the positions that they were in. That's just me. Picks that I do like, though. Number 15, Devin Williams. I love this pick at 15. I personally felt that this was my favorite pick out of all of them. I am so glad that Devin Williams got the recognition he deserves because he's been arguably the best relief pitcher in baseball in the latter half of the year, and really the entire year at that. His ERA has only been above 3 in one instance this year, and he collected at least one strikeout in 20 of his 21 appearances he had for the Brewers this season. So think about it. He is generating at least a K, if not more. I mean, there was multiple, and I didn't sit through and count them, but there was multiple games where he had 2 Ks, 3 Ks. I mean, there's a couple games he had 4 and 5 Ks. He finished the year with a 0.36 ERA, 52 total Ks in 25 innings, which are pretty insane numbers when you think about it. I mean, that's just a little over 2 Ks per appearance, which for a relief guy is an incredible rate. I mean, don't be shocked to see his name being called for the Rookie of the Year, and that's how good he's been. I mean, really, he's been that good. I can't remember the award that he won recently. I think it was the NL Reliever of the Month for September. But again, I wouldn't be shocked if he won, the Reliever of the Year because he was that good. I mean, if you're averaging 2+ Ks per appearance, per outing that you make as a relief guy, that's equivalent. I mean, I don't have it in front of me, and I don't really know how that would translate over, but just out of a guess, that's probably equivalent to a starting pitcher, having a 7 or 8, strikeout average per start. which is pretty impressive. I mean, that averaging that many strikeouts per start would be really hard to do. Next guy that I really liked, Trevor Bauer at number 7. I think Bauer was lights out this year and was really one of the few consistent players on this Reds team. Bauer was unhittable the entire year with an NL leading 1.73 ERA in 73 innings and 100 Ks. He was, again, only one of 3 pitchers the entire year and in the entire league to have, that strikeout total of 100 or more. Bauer is an easy Cy Young candidate, but he will be challenged by the back-to-back Cy Young winner, Jacob deGrom, who had just as good of a season as Bauer did. Bauer only walked 17 batters all year, and he gave up 9 homers. So not a bad efficiency rate in terms of getting guys out and keeping guys off the base path. An incredible year for Bauer, much deserved in being, in that top 10. A guy that I felt was very deserving of that. I really did. Next guy, and now we're getting into the later round, or the later rankings. We're getting further down the list into, the 40s, but these are rookies. These are rookie players, and that they are starting to make this much noise. We have to make mention of them. First guy, Sixto Sanchez for the Marlins at number 41. This guy's going to have a bright future ahead of him, and although he was placed in the 40s, again, I think it was very deserving that he got any recognition at all. At 22 years old, Sanchez had a solid year in his rookie campaign, pitching in 39 innings, 33 Ks, a 3-2 record, and a 3.46 ERA, so a solid stat line for a rookie. A guy who is going to be fun to watch in the league for sure. He's got a great fastball, a lot of velocity on his pitches, and a lot of people are touting him as one of the best pitchers the Marlins have had in years. So someone who is just getting started in the MLB, and with his already impressive career, he's going to be a force to be reckoned with in the future. And something that's very interesting about him, coming into this year, he hadn't had a whole lot of experience in the minors. I'm pretty sure that they had, they had signed him, he came over in that trade with JT Realmuto. So he was initially with the Phillies. Comes over to the Marlins. I think he spent some time in the minors with the Phillies, but he didn't go past, advanced A. I mean, he didn't go very high up in the farm system, but he was unbelievable. I mean, I don't even think he had a 1 ERA. I think he had a 0.5 ERA through like 12 appearances or 10 appearances, something like that in his minor league career. He was pretty lights out. He doesn't have a whole lot of experience in the minors, but I mean, he showed this year that he doesn't need that much experience. I mean, he's able to pitch at this high level. And then the last guy that I really liked that he was ranked and that he got recognition, Will Smith, not the actor, the Dodgers catcher, at number 42. Smith improved drastically over the season, and in the middle part of September, he really started to take a jump in terms of level of play, especially from the plate. He finished the year with a 289 average after hovering around 200 for much of August. So a player that is getting hot at the right time for this already dangerous Dodgers team. And with 8 homers and 25 RBIs and a 980 OPS, Smith adds even more to this lineup, and he really showed in the latter half of the year that he's capable of coming up big from the plate and that he can be that added piece that LA needs. Not to mention he's a great catcher behind the plate also. So a multifaceted player that can do a lot of different things. I think there's a bright future ahead for Will Smith. A lot of really great talent on this list and in the playoffs in general. I know I am excited I'm just very excited to see all of these, players in the playoffs. I'm excited to get these playoffs in full swing and really to start to see more postseason action. We've already seen some great performances. I mean, going back to Trevor Bauer, he had a great performance in Game 1 on Wednesday. Again, a lot of exciting stuff moving forward for this, postseason and for these players as well. So that will close things out here for us in our second segment on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Coming up after the commercial break, I'm going to share some of the best and most memorable wildcard moments in recent years, which teams were involved, and what the outcome was of those games. Folks, it's been a lot of fun so far, but we got a lot more to go, so don't change that channel. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Great to have you all here still with me today. Jack Ridenour again, and we just finished discussing MLB.com's top 50 player rankings for the players in the postseason this year, as I shared which picks I was a fan of and which I wasn't a big fan of and why, and who I would have liked to seen move up the list some a little bit here and there. I want to now get into the ranking of the top 5 greatest wildcard games in postseason history, a very short history of the wildcard, but still a lot of memorable games occurring in this opening round of playoffs. I thought it would be very fitting considering the fact that we are in the middle of the wild card series right now. So I thought, hey, why not? We'll do a little segment on that. Getting in at number 5, my number 5 greatest wild card game of all time, 2012, St. Louis Cardinals versus the Atlanta Braves. Now in 2012, both of these teams entered the game as two of the best teams in their own respective categories, hitting for the Cardinals and pitching for the Braves, which is semi-ironic because this year their pitching staff, that is the Braves, is nowhere near what it was in 2012 at all. Now, I will say Max Fried is pretty unbelievable, but after that, it really dips down. It was also Kyle Loesch for the Cardinals, who had a career year in 2012 with a 16-3 record, 143 Ks with an NL high 33 starts, going against the Braves' Chris Medlin, who also had his best statistical year in 2012 with a 10-1 record and a 120 K season. The Cardinals were 88-74 on the year, and Atlanta was 94-68. So two fairly even teams going up against each other. Obviously, the Braves having a little bit of the edge in terms of the record. The game started with Atlanta scoring the first 2 runs of the game with a homer off of David Ross, who is now the Cubs manager, to put the score at 2-0 Atlanta. St. Louis answered with scoring 3 runs a few innings later to give themselves a 3-2 lead going into the latter half of the win or go home matchup. The Cardinals tacked on another run in the 6th off of a Matt Holliday home run, and then 2 more in the 7th before Atlanta scored another in the bottom of the 7th. Now, this is where things got a little interesting in the bottom of the 8th. With 2 men on and Aldriton Simmons at bat for the Braves, he popped one up between the shortstop and left fielder, which actually dropped as there was a little bit of miscommunication between Matt Holliday playing in left and Pete Kozma at short. So between the miscommunication, ball gets popped up, drops in between the two, and it lands, and nobody catches it. Simmons was actually, though, called out after the umpire had signaled for the infield fly rule, which resulted in Atlanta not having the bases loaded with 1 out. Ultimately, the Braves couldn't muster any more of a comeback, and eventually they fell to St. Louis 6-3 in a near come-from-behind victory for Atlanta. And I actually do remember that 2012 Cardinals team because the next round, I'm pretty sure it was, they took on the Nationals. I went to an NLDS Nationals-Cardinals game, and I'll never forget this. It's just kind of a brief playoff memory of mine. I'm sitting in the outfield with my parents, and I'll never forget this. The Nationals go up, I think it was 6-1. Bryce Harper hit a huge home run. I'm trying to remember who else was on the team at that time. But Jason Worth also was, he was really good that day. A lot of other guys that played well for the Nationals that day. Ultimately, though, the Cardinals came back and won. And I can't remember how the sequence went, but they tied it up at 6, and then they took a 1-run lead. And then about a couple innings later, I think the Nationals took a 2-run lead. They went up either 9-7 or 8-6, one of the two, something like that. And then all of a sudden, I'll never forget this. I think it was either Drew Storen or Craig Stammen, but he walked the bases loaded with, I think, 1 out, no outs. And then it just was a field day for the Cardinals from there. And I'll never forget that. I think it was actually Game 5 that sent the Nationals home. And they were the home field advantage team. And I do remember that in the game before that, Jason Worth had hit a absolute moonshot of a walk-off home run. I'll never forget watching that at my house with my parents, my stepmother going absolutely wild, running around the house. I'd never seen anything like it. I was shocked. I was literally speechless, and my dad was laughing in the background, just couldn't believe it happened also. Just a very, very unbelievable thing to have happen, but just a little playoff memory that I have with the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, getting into my next top wild card game, number 4, the 2013 Pittsburgh Pirates versus Cincinnati Reds. This one also, it has always stood out to me because I remember when Johnny Cueto for the Reds was on the mound and he dropped the ball. It was a very infamous, clip, little replay. The fans are going nuts. He drops the ball. It resulted in a cacophony of boos from the Pittsburgh fans, and they were just going nuts. They absolutely... they laid into Johnny Cueto as fans. And then he wound up giving up a home run either the very next pitch or the very next at-bat. So clearly Cueto was a little shaken up by the Pittsburgh fans. But this was a great year to be a Pirates fan because they finished second in the Central and they had a 94-68 record. Take a second to think about that now. They were 94-68. the Pittsburgh Pirates 7 years ago. They're 7 years removed from this. This was the first of 3 straight years the Pirates actually won 85 or more games. They won 88 the next year and then 98 in 2015. Cincinnati, on the other hand, have themselves a year as well. I mean, a really good one, winning 90 games on the season. So it was a battle of 2 90-plus win teams. They made for a great game. The Pirates got things rolling early on with 2 runs in the bottom of the second and 1 in the bottom of the third. The Reds were able to answer in the fourth with a run in the top half of the inning, but Pittsburgh still built on that 3-1 lead and added 2 more runs in the bottom of the fourth to make it 5-1. Ultimately, the Reds didn't have it in them to come back and fell to the Pirates 6-2. The Pirates went on to lose in the next round of the Cardinals, but those 3 years were some wonderful years for the Pirates. And being a Pittsburgh inhabitant, somebody that lives here and having many, many friends, I mean, lots of friends. I was actually in a conversation with one of my friends yesterday about it, big Pittsburgh fan, Pittsburgh native. And I mean, he was even saying that just the moves that their front office has made in the past has just been very questionable, very, very questionable. And, you know, I really hope that they can get back to their winning ways because these are some great fans here in Pittsburgh. I mean, I've got family that are big Pittsburgh fans, you know, obviously, like I mentioned, friends. And, you know, it's really, you know, unfortunate to see them have to struggle because, I mean, I semi get it. I mean, as a big Brewers fan, you know, in previous years, I mean, besides the last 3 years, it's been a pretty tough go at it, no question. I mean, in between, you know, 2010, 2011, and 2018, those 7 years were they were long years. So I definitely understand what they're kind of going through, but at the same time, I don't because, I mean, Pittsburgh is almost laughable. They've gotten to that point, and it's really unfortunate because I think it's a very, you know, obviously it's a storied franchise. It's one of the older teams in baseball. It's one of the more historic teams in baseball, but they just haven't been able to get anything going lately. So hopefully with the new management, the new general management, the new front office, and just a whole new makeup, they can eventually maybe get back to how they were from 2013 to 2015. Next game, my number 3 wildcard performance, 2016 Toronto Blue Jays versus the Baltimore Orioles. Now, 2016 was a fantastic year for Toronto, mainly because they found themselves in the playoffs in back-to-back years for the first time since 1992 and 1993. Both years they made the playoffs. Similar for the Orioles, they had not been in the playoffs since 1997. So 2 teams that clearly had been left out of the playoff picture for a good chunk of the early 2000s and 2010s. Toronto was in the second place spot in the East with a 89-73 record, while the Orioles finished in the same exact record. This one, unlike the first 2, featured an extra inning finish for these 2 teams, one that I don't think anyone really predicted. The Blue Jays got to work early, scoring the first run of the game in the bottom of the second inning, but the Orioles, they came right back by scoring 2 in the top of the fourth. But before the Jays were able to tie it up at 3 with a run in the bottom of the fifth. So going into the 6th inning, it's all tied up at 3. The Jays started Marcus Stroman. He pitched an incredible game, but it was Francisco Liriano that came in for the Jays that was able to really hold the Orioles offensively and allow the Jays to force an extra inning showdown. After both teams put up scoreless frames in the 10th innings, they went into the 11th inning with a 2-2 tie still. For whatever reason, and again, this is something that, you know, I don't know, and I am a DC native, so I don't really know a whole lot of Orioles fans. I did grow up going to a lot of Orioles games because it was the only team around at that time. But for whatever reason, and this is something that is still criticized today, Buck Showalter, the manager of the Orioles at the time, he sent out Ubaldo Jimenez to pitch in the 11th inning. And for anybody who doesn't remember Ubaldo Jimenez, he had a great career for the Rockies for a couple years. He was an all-star one time. I think he had 19 wins one year or 20 wins one year, one of the two. He had a really good year for the Rockies. Really just kind of hit a downward spiral after that, though, and just was not the same pitcher. And they left the Orioles closer and the AL reliever of the year, Zach Britton, sitting in the bullpen. No idea to the life of me why that was a thing. I don't know why. I don't know if he saw something in the matchup or, you know, if the next couple guys that were due up for the Blue Jays, he did not like the pitcher-batter, the pitcher-batter, duel, the matchup or whatever. I don't know what it was. I mean, Britton led the AL in saves that year with 47. Jimenez was on his last leg of his career and had a losing record on the year as well. And it was his second to last year in the MLB as well. Jimenez allowed 2 runners on base in the 11th inning before Edwin Encarnacion stepped up to the plate and belted a walk-off home run to send the Blue Jays to the division series and sending the Orioles back home. It was only the 4th time that a win-or-go-home matchup ended in a playoff in a walk-off. And I'm sure it is a game that Showalter, Britton, and the entire Orioles Orioles organization wish they had back, especially the fans. I'm sure the fans are still livid to this day. I personally would never bring that up around an Orioles fan. I probably would set them off. But again, that was a great year for Toronto. I often forget that they went to the ALCS that year. They ultimately lost to the Indians. But, again, it's a very positive sign that for any of these teams that are kind of just run-of-the-mill, kind of the middle-of-the-road teams that don't get a whole lot of publicity, that they're able to make some noise in the playoffs. I mean, they're a wild card team that went to the ALCS. I mean, look at maybe the Cincinnati Reds. If they win in Game 2 against the Braves, people should watch out for the Reds. I know I'm very high up on the Padres and very high up on the White Sox, but I think the Reds are a sleeper team. I think that they're a big-time sleeper team that nobody's really talking about, and I think that ultimately, if the pitching can continue to be at the level it was in Game 1, and if they can get any sort of offensive production from their guys, Eugenio Suarez needs to get going. Nick Castellanos had a couple big hits. He had a double on the day in Game 1. Mike Moustakas, he's been really struggling. Another guy coming into the postseason that could pick things up a little bit. That is, that instance right there in 2016 for the Blue Jays, it is a sign that these wildcard teams are able to make it further in the playoffs. So look for a team like the Reds who could potentially make some noise if they win in Game 2, and then they force a Game 3, win that. Who knows? They could be kind of the Cinderella team this year in the playoffs. Getting in for number 2 now for the wild card, 2016 San Francisco Giants versus the New York Mets. Now, in the same year, and over in the, in the same year, and over in the other league of the MLB and the NL, very, very similar to, over in the 2016 AL wildcard, the 2016 NL wildcard was just as good. The Giants and the Mets were going at it in a do-or-die game as well. Similar to in the AL, like I mentioned, both the Giants and the Mets had the same records with an 87 win and 75 loss total. This was bound to be an even matchup. It was a Noah Syndergaard versus Madison Bumgarner showdown, and boy, was it a good battle. Both pitchers didn't allow one run through the first 4 innings that carried on throughout the entire game, all the way up until the top of the 9th inning. Now, in the top of the 9th, that is where things got interesting. Juris Familia came to the mound for the Mets to hopefully shut out the Giants and head into the bottom of the 9th inning, which would have given this team a solid chance at winning, they only needed 1 run to score. But that did not happen. Familia gave up a 3-run homer to Connor Gillespie after allowing a leadoff double to Brandon Crawford and then walking Joe Panik. The Mets were unable to put together any sort of comeback and ultimately fell 3-0 to the Giants. And again, that's another franchise, just like the Pirates, another storied team. The Mets just cannot seem to have any sort of positive outcome for them in recent years. I mean, they went to the playoffs, a couple times here and there throughout the 2010s. Obviously, in the wild card there, right in that instance. Earlier in the 2000s, they were finding themselves in the NLCS and in the World Series. So it's just unfortunate that. I think that I don't know if this is just a thing with teams that are in, 2 teams that are in one city. One always gets put on the back burner, and it's clear it's the Mets. Everybody always pays attention to the Yankees, and it's clear the Mets are kind of put up on the top shelf. But at the same time, they're a very storied franchise. The Miracle Mets. If you got a nickname for your team, and it's a reference to a certain time period in which your team was good, you were a good team. You were a really, really good team. So again, like the Pirates, I hope that the Mets can eventually turn things around and, build back into the team that they were so many years ago and really in the past ultimately. Now, my number 1 wild card game of all time, 2014 Kansas City Royals versus the Oakland Athletics. What an exciting game this had to have been for these 2 teams, but the fans who were there also. This was the beginning of the very short run the Royals had in the playoffs in 2014 and 2015. So this was the very beginning of this run initially taking on the A's. The A's and the Royals were virtually similar teams record-wise, with the A's having an 88 and 74 total, while the Royals had an 89 and 73 record. So very similar teams. This Royals team had the most wins it had seen as a team since 1985 when they last won the World Series. And the A's were on their 3rd straight trip to the postseason after posting a great first half of the year, but a very slow second half. The A's sent John Lester, who they acquired during the trade deadline, and the Royals had James Shields take the mound in the pivotal 1-game playoff. The 2 teams started off early offensively, with the A's scoring 2 runs in the top of the first inning while the Royals cut their deficit in half going into the second, adding 1 lone run in the bottom of the first. Kansas City eventually took the lead in the bottom of the 3rd off of 2 RBI RBI hits by Eric Hosmer and Lorenzo Cain, giving the Royals a 3-2 advantage. The next two innings were scoreless, but Oakland blew the door wide open in the sixth inning, and this is what was wild about this. I mean, they scored 5 runs in the top half of the frame and giving themselves a 7-3 lead. So they're going into, the 8th inning, 6 outs away of moving on. And things were starting to, really look hopeful. I mean, they were 6 outs away. I mean, the Royals were 6 outs away, but things really started looking hopeful for them. They scored 3 runs in the bottom 8th frame. The A's had to just hold the Royals for one more inning, and they would be moving into the next round, but that was not the case. The Royals tacked on another run to push it into extras, and now, with a couple, or with a complete momentum shift, the Royals felt very confident heading into the extra innings. The 10th and 11th innings were scoreless, but going into the 12th, that was where things started to get weird. The A's put the pressure on the Royals by scoring 1 run in the top of the 12th, but the Royals were not finished. And after Cain was able to get on base to lead off, Eric Hosmer sent a shot to the outfield, and it was played poorly and subsequently allowed Hosmer to go to third. So Christian Colon was able to get a single that scored Hosmer, tying the game up at 8 in the 12th. After Hosmer stole second, it set Salvador Perez up for driving in the game-winning run, which he did, hitting a ground ball right by the outstretch of the glove of Josh Donaldson at third, which resulted in a win for the Royals, sending them to the ALDS. And that was actually the beginning, like I briefly mentioned, kind of the beginning to their very small window that they had in 2014 and 2015 to win. And they did win. I mean, they won in 2014. They didn't win the whole World Series, but they went there. And in 2015, they won the whole thing. So again, another example of a team that you see that window, you've got to take advantage of it. And I think a team that, to compare that to right now is the Reds. They are in that window right now, right as we speak. And I don't think they had the season that they, ultimately wanted. But I think that as time goes on, this is going to be a team that's going to build themselves up into being a much better, formidable opponent in the NL Central. So, some very monumental games that have been played in the do or die matchups over the years. And we have already seen some great matchups this year in the odd yet new layout to the playoffs. But hey, we get more baseball, so we can't complain about that. So that'll do it for this segment, folks. Thanks for sticking around, but stay right there. We'll be right back after this commercial break for the final segment today, where I will highlight some struggling players who could potentially turn their seasons around in the playoffs. So don't go anywhere, everyone, because we have one last segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for the final segment here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Jack Ridenour still with you, and in the last segment, I ranked the greatest wildcard games in MLB history and which ones really stuck out to me the most. I want to now mention a few players who I think could really turn their season around in the playoffs after having a struggling regular season. So my first player that I have to mention, and there's a lot of guys on this list that people will probably be a little shocked by, but again, it's just, I'm basing it off of the year that they had. I'm not saying that they are bad players in general. I'm just saying that based off of the year that they had, they are on this list. First guy, and I've mentioned him a lot on this show, Cody Bellinger. Bellinger has struggled all year long, and it is a big difference from his 2019 season. His average has dropped from 305 to 239, and his OPS has really dipped from 1.035 in 2019 to 789 this year. And clearly, with this year, the home run and RBI numbers are a little off because of the COVID-19 pandemic and less games. But percentage-wise, clearly a down year for Bellinger. Clearly a down year. And in his career, he isn't the best hitter either in the playoffs, with only a 178 average and a 560 OPS with 4 homers, and he has seen a lot of action in the playoffs as his team has been remarkable the last few years. He's been homerless in his last 10 playoff at-bats, but he did finish the year on a little bit of a roll hitting-wise, compiling at least a hit or more, so 1 hit or more in 10 of the last 11 games of the season with 2 homers, so he has picked up the level of play a little bit since the end of the season. But with their matchup against the Brewers and potentially taking on their NL West rivals, the Padres and the NLDS, if both teams were to advance out of the wildcard round, Bellinger has to keep up this hitting momentum that he has found in the last few weeks of the season if he wants to turn this season around for himself. Because if he's able to do that, it's going to be a tough road for any team that runs into them this postseason. I really do believe that. Bellinger did improve over the entire month of September, batting .267 for the entire month, which was his best month hitting-wise. But power-wise, his best month was August with 10 homers and 20 RBIs in the month. So he has shown glimpses of improving over the season. But will that come to light and fruition in the postseason? We're going to have to see about that. Christian Yelich is my next player who I think could really turn his season around if he were to, pick it up a little bit here very, very quickly, because who knows if they'll be able to, take on the Dodgers and move past them. I mean, what is there to say positively about Yelich's 2020 year, right? The guy slumped the entire season, coming off 2 straight years where he put up identical numbers that he actually improved from 2018 to 2019. So a player that was really riding high the last 2 years. Batting .329 in 2019 and .326 in 2018, and winning an MVP in 2018, Yelich has shown the talent and ability he has as a player. But this has not been, his year hitting. He's hitting a career low .205. The only time he's ever batted under .250 in his entire career. And he finished with a .786 OPS and only 12 homers, which again, we can't weigh that much based off the fact of the pandemic season. But one thing's for certain, that this year's Yelich is very different from the last 2 years. Yelich is a legitimate 1,000 OPS player, but this year not so much. And similar to Bellinger, he isn't the best playoff hitter either, with a 194 average in his playoff career and only 2 home runs. And with their opening game, again, against the Dodgers, the pitching matchup doesn't favor Yelich either, as he hits 164 this year against righties. But I will say he did have a good day from the plate against Buehler. He was 2 for 5. So although in terms of looking at on paper, it did not really add up well for Yelich, but he ultimately was able to overcome that. The chances of Yelich really turning his season around are slim, though, because of the fact that they have a monster feat ahead of them in the Dodgers, and this matchup doesn't go well for them either as a team. So Yelich will have a very small window to improve this season, or to improve his season in these playoffs. Again, heading into Game 2, it's do or die for the Brewers. I mean, their backs are literally up against the wall, and if they can't get it done, then he's going home. He's going to have no shot of redeeming himself this season. But I think ultimately, if they do move past the Dodgers, if that were to be the case, we could maybe see Christian Yelich having a much better outcome to his season than he initially started with, for sure. Next guy, Mike Moustakas. Moustakas was a very poor performer for much of the month of August and September, but earlier in the season, in the first few games, he was hitting well above 300. As he slowly declined, it became clear he was not going to live up to the expectations that people set before him and their entire team when him and Castellanos were picked up in the offseason. So clearly, they did not live up to the hype that I think a lot of people came into the season having about them. A mostly 220 to 230 hitter in September, Moustakas needs that bat to wake up if he wants to see himself turn the year around at all, but to also help his team out. So, again, his team has been playing very well earlier against in the season, as they were they finished out the season being probably one of the better teams in baseball. And they also had a very good outing against the Braves in Game 1. We'll see how they fare against in Game 2. But again, due to the great pitching of Bauer, they were really able to keep themselves in that game. Now, Moustakas is a .211 career hitter in the playoffs, and he only has 6 homers in the postseason. But Moustakas is no stranger to being in the limelight, as he has seen a lot of success in the playoffs with mid-market teams in the past, winning a World Series with the Royals and going to the NLCS with the Brewers in the 2018 playoffs. Not to mention going to an ALCS with the Royals in 2014 as well. This guy, he's got a lot of potential, and he has shown he's capable of being a great hitter. But if his team wants to propel themselves past this wild card round, and if he wants to turn his season around personally, he's going to have to really crank it up a notch here this week and try to turn the season around, because if not, it's going to be a really long offseason for Mike Moustakas. Again, him and Castellanos were signed to literally the same deal. I think it was 4 years, $64 million. So virtually, they're viewed as the same kind of players in the eyes of the Reds. I think that Moustakas has a little bit more to show. Same thing with Castellanos. He had a great year to start, but I will say as time went on and as his season continued to progress, he really fizzled out. I mean, his average went from well above 300, and he was hitting well over, 1,000 OPS to dropping down to, around an 800 or so OPS, which is, again, a modest number. It's a solid OPS. I mean, I always like to consider, 850, 875 OPS and higher to be, solid OPS numbers. I would give that to be solid OPS numbers. But again, he really did not show, I think the talent level that he is capable of having. I mean, I almost put Castellanos on this list as well, but I think Moustakas had more of a struggle this year than Castellanos did. Moving on to my next guy, Javier Baez. I mean, Baez has clearly been struggling this year. He's hitting 203. He's got a 0.6 WAR, which is pitiful, and only a 238 OBP as well. It is clear that Baez has had a hard time getting on base and getting any hits, really. After going to back-to-back All-Star, All-Star games in the previous years, this year clearly wouldn't have been an all-star year for him at all, as just 2 years ago, he led the NL in RBIs with 111. The Cubs have, across the board been struggling to hit, but still find themselves in a solid postseason, a solid position in the postseason, and if they want to move on to the next round, guys like Baez, they're going to need to get going and need to turn their season around to try and help out their squad as much as possible. They're right now in a 1-0 deficit to the Marlins, so they're one game away from getting knocked out. I'm really looking to see Baez try and, turn things around for his team and for the season. He also had a hard time fielding wise this year. Although he does not get a lot of action as a middle infielder, he did have the third highest errors committed in the NL this year, but he did have the second most assists as a shortstop as well. So somebody that is clearly, he is a good fielder. I'm not saying that he's not because he, had the third most errors or whatever, but he gets a lot of action. So as a result, it's kind of like a point guard in basketball. A point guard in basketball is touching the ball 85% of the time in the game. They're going to ultimately probably turn the ball over a little bit more than somebody else would if they're not handling the ball as often. And it doesn't mean anything about that point guard. It just means that they're going to be, more likely to turn it over. Just like as a shortstop that's getting a lot of action over at shortstop. I mean, I don't have a chart in front of me, but I'm sure if you did see a chart, I bet you most hits that are on the ground wind up over towards short or second in some sort of way, in kind of that pull direction if you're a righty or a lefty, just depending on which side of the plate you're hitting from. But he's going to get a lot of reps. He's going to get a lot of action at shortstop. And so he did have the second most assists at shortstop, showing that, percentage-wise, he's a great fielder. So he did have a good year fielding-wise. But again, I mean, committing that many errors, you don't want to see that, obviously, but it was also on a smaller sample size. Now, in the postseason, he is a 228 average hitter with a 662 OPS and 14 RBIs. So he also doesn't have a lot of success in the playoffs. But with how weird this year is, and it is, possible that a player like Baez is able to turn their season around and eventually have themselves a very solid finish to the season. My next player, Miguel Sano. I mean, he has a negative WAR and almost a sub-200 average on the year and a league-high 90 strikeouts. Talk about a brutal year for Sano. With only 89 total bases, he had more Ks than he had total bases, and he had more Ks than he did hits as well. Sano is known for his power hitting ability and his ability to drive in runs as well. With 2 of the last 3 seasons driving in 70-plus runs, he has the capability of being a solid hitter, but he hasn't had much of any luck in the last year or two of hitting a high percentage. And with his OPS being down almost 200 points from a year ago, kind of concerning if you are the Indians. In only 4 postseason games, he has struggled immensely with only a 125 career average. So this is a big year for Sano. Not having 100-plus games under his belt, he'd be a little bit more, I think, rested, you'd think. And so, we could see his hitting improve in these playoffs. Again, he's no longer in the playoffs, and he didn't really show it, but I think that he did have a big challenge ahead of him going up against the Astros, and he was able to manage 1 hit in the playoffs this year, and that came, in the 1 game against the Astros. September, again, was not a good month for Sano. He only batted 148 the entire year, he only batted 148 in the month. The entire year was a struggle, it was just struggle for Sano. And if he wants to turn this season around, well, ultimately he can't anymore, but if he wanted to turn that season around, he was going to have to really perform well in the opening games of the postseason, but ultimately didn't really get a whole big of a shot of that because they got swept by the Yankees, but still, look to see Sano maybe come back better than ever next year. Matt Chapman is my next guy, and Chapman has quickly established himself as a power hitter in the league, showing it last year with 36 homers and 91 RBIs with an 848 OPS, and having back-to-back years in 2018 and 2019 that were over 800 OPS or better. He had 54 Ks to only 8 walks this year, so his strikeout rate was very high this year. But that seems to be a trend for Chapman, who had 73 walks last year to 147 Ks. Chapman is one of the main power hitters on this team, and with Olsen also being a big power hitter for them, and Marcus Semien, and honestly, you could probably put all three of these players on this list, mainly because all three of them have been struggling this year. Chapman is hitting .232 this year with 10 homers, so he did produce pretty decent power numbers this year, but his WAR was way down from the last 2 years, where, it was above 8 in both seasons. I mean, he had a wildly high WAR. He had an 8.3 WAR, to be exact, in 2018 and 2019. So astronomically high. I mean, they say that 8 and above is MVP caliber. So that right there, I mean, that was MVP caliber in those 2 years. He's only played in 2 games in the postseason, batting .250 in the 2 games combined with 2 hits total, and no homers or RBIs. But the OPS hasn't been very good either, with it being only a 583 clip in the first 2 playoff games. So clearly a guy who doesn't do a great job in the playoffs, but it is a clear, it's a very small sample size. Again, I mean, he hasn't had a whole lot of opportunity, hasn't had a whole lot of reps in the playoffs, so you can't really gauge it a whole lot off of that. He was third in the AL in both 2018 and 2019 in WAR, and he was first in both years in defensive WAR with a 3.6 clip in 2018 and a 3.9 clip in 2019. I mean, he's got a great glove. I'm pretty sure he's a third baseman, so he's got a great glove. He's over at the hot corner, and having a defensive WAR that high, again, that's pretty impressive. 2020 has not been a good year for Chapman, who clearly he's seen a decline in his numbers, but this playoffs, I mean, could be exactly what he is needing to try and turn this unfortunate season for himself right around to allow for a strong finish to the year. Again, they've got a big pivotal game coming up against the White Sox. We'll see if they can continue on their playoff run, and if not, then he's going to have to wait till next year to prove himself. But if they're able to win, I think that Chapman, Matt Olsen, Marcus Semien had a 2-run home run, so things might be on the up and up for the Athletics. I mean, they're in game 3 situation. It's do or die. It's 1-1. This is where Chapman should step up to the plate and should, walk right up to the limelight and say, hey, I can do this. I can take on this role, and I can really be, a productive player. My last player, and I put him on here because I'm kind of putting him on here as almost a challenge. And I mean, obviously he's probably not going to listen to this, but with all of the stuff that had gone on in this in the offseason, I bring up a lot about the Astros allocations and their scandal because, I remember hearing all the news about it. It was probably one of the most groundbreaking things in baseball, cheating-wise, since the steroid era. And in all honesty, a lot of people said this is probably bigger than steroids because now you're taking out the idea of biologically manipulating your body, and now you're literally using technology. You're literally using sign stealing and, banging on trash cans, and you're doing it in other weird, between technology and very rudimentary ways of communicating. All of that mixed together, I mean, it allowed them to go to multiple World Series. And Jose Altuve, who I'm about to get into right now, I mean, he was right in the middle of it. I mean, a lot of it circled around him, and he was one of the big named players on the Astros team that, people felt he knew a lot about it, and he was very involved in it, him and Bregman. And, unfortunately to this day, my view of those two, their reputations in my eyes has drastically decreased and has declined incredibly. But again, what is there to say about, Altuve's year? Not much. Really, not much at all. I mean, he had a negative WAR of negative 0.4. He had a .219 average, which is, over 70 points lower than what he finished with last year. And not to mention, the OPS is almost 300 points below what it was the year before as well. His offensive WAR was in the negative as well. A big shock, I know, which again shows the struggle he has had this entire season. I put him on this list, again, because of the main reason being the cheating scandal that happened last year and all those allegations and everything that went on in the offseason. His name is mentioned a lot, and then all of a sudden he's hitting near the Mendoza line and not having the year he's used to having. It definitely makes you wonder if that was the reason he was hitting so well. And this postseason, he has a lot to prove, I think. With how poor the entire team has performed, they need to show the world that they can play without cheating. And Altuve needs to show that he can still hit well without having someone bang on a trash can to let him know what kind of pitch is going to come next. Only time will tell if Altuve can pull his reputation out of the mud, but this postseason and his performance in it will be one of the ways in which he's able to turn things around for himself in this season and for his career. And not to mention, I mean, they've got second life now. They were a sub 500 team going into the playoffs, and now they're moving on into the ALDS. So that should tell you one thing and one thing only. This Astros team, they are capable of turning it up a little bit when push comes to shove. So, I mean, we'll have to see how Altuve fares in the ALDS. Was pretty quiet in the wild card rounds. Didn't really do much of anything, if that. And it just is kind of, unfortunate that at one point, I think his jersey was one of the most popular jersey sales in all of baseball. A lot of little kids looked up to him. A lot of just players, everybody looked up to him because this is a 5'7", baseball player that's hitting, moonshots, and he's having an unbelievable career. He's having an unbelievable year. He had 5 or 6 really awesome years, an all-star, he was a silver slugger, so on and so forth. And then all this stuff comes out about him. It's like, and I kind of relate it to Ryan Braun. How all of that came out with Ryan Braun a couple years ago and his cheating scandal, except he was using steroids. But again, very similar. His reputation really went downhill from there. And I think the same thing is kind of happening to Altuve, just in a different regard. So again, as we know, a lot of guys who struggled this year, and it was a really weird year. And it's been no question about that. So we can see how it affected some of the players with the weird season this year has been. We'll see how it continues to affect any of these players moving forward into the playoffs. I know some of these players might be bounced out by the time you listen to this on Saturday, and some of these players are already gone, like Miguel Sano. He's already packed his bags and went home. But for the others that are still alive and remaining in the playoffs, we could see maybe a little bit of a turning of the tide, a turning of the page in their season for this year. So that'll wrap it up for us here today on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, that would be much appreciated so we can keep you in the loop on all of this good playoff updates coming down the road. Once again, everyone, thanks so much for joining me today, and have a fantastic day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.